Mr. Brian Henry, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. How are you doing, Matt?
Doing very well. Good, very good. Thank you, Brian. Doing very good. Thank you for joining us on the Infrastructure Podcast. Always great to have a chat. Um, you've got a very interesting past, and an interesting last couple of years. And I would hate to do the misjustice of not introducing you properly. So, can I hand over to you and tell us about yourself and your newly departed roles?
Of course, no trouble at all. I'm Brian Henry. I'm just literally completing my 2 year stint as interim CIO
Yeah.
and transformation director for St. John Ambulance. My, I guess, career history last 10 years or so has been these kind of interim assignments, either as CIO or transformation director across sectors in the UK.
Okay. So I'm really interested later on to have a chat about the dynamic of being an interim CIO as opposed to, and I don't want to do this any misjustice, as a fully fledged, full-time permanent CIO. But my memories of St. John's Ambulance, and when I think of St. John's Ambulance, is when I used to play, under 12s, under 13s football. I used to be at maybe a football tournament or something, and there would be a St. John's Ambulance ready on the side of the pitch. But I'm guessing there's probably more to it than that, and some people will probably have similar memories. So, would you mind giving us an introduction to the
Of course.
organisation?
Of course, no trouble at all. And I think it's fair to say that most people have that recollection. So
Yeah.
most people's first contact with the organisation is through our role in events, whether that's playing sport like yourself, whether that's at a stadium attending a match, or indeed at a concert for Taylor Swift or whoever your particular favourite is. But we're a hell of a lot more than that. So I'll probably give you a few dimensions of it. So, firstly, we're the leading first aid training organisation in the country. In 2021, which is the last year for which we've got full figures, we've trained about 200,000 people in terms of workplace first aid. So, pretty large training organisation. We're now also the National Ambulance Auxiliary to the NHS. So that's nationwide. So the NHS has the ambulance trusts have auxiliary services in different regions, but we are the sole national auxiliary service. So big kind of function there. One area that you may or may not be familiar with, though, which is quite pivotal recently, is the role that we took in the pandemic. So we recruited and trained 28,000 volunteers in the early days of the pandemic, and those individuals, through a change in the law, were capable that were given in the early days of the vaccine rollout. Estimates somewhere between a quarter and a third of the vaccinations were given by volunteers in the country, all of whom were trained and brought into role by ourselves. So that's been a pretty big one. Final thing I'll probably mention is we're also a fairly massive, large youth organisation. So our badgers and cadets effectively are people who are training in first aid right the way through till children and young people. So that's the kind of feel for the type of organisation.
So a bit more than just Sunday football and being ready in case there's a graze or a broken ankle, then, right?
Indeed.
Um,
Yeah, and I guess just to give you a feel, that's something in the region of 1,500 employees in the country, and volunteers somewhere in the region of 40,000. Yeah, at any given time, a smaller number of those are active, but something in the region of 40,000.
and like, how many ambulances do you have actively? And I know this is only a segment of the business, but it's a good way to, it's a good data point to have. How many ambulances may be roaming at any one time or active for St. John's Ambulance?
Kind of a couple of hundred sort of thing. Yeah. So right up and down the country.
Okay. And you just touched upon a few mega trends and changes that have happened in the business over the past few years, and that was, due to the pandemic, of course. But what kind of direction, and this can include stuff that happened in the pandemic, since the last 5 years or so, what transformations have happened or are happening at St. John's Ambulance that are of importance to that organization?
Yeah, so I'd probably flag two things. So one is directly linked to the pandemic. So across the pandemic, we played a very large role supporting the NHS. So the vaccination I mentioned, the ambulance work, but also hospital volunteering. We've proved ourselves to be a very reliable partner to the NHS. So the key strategic question for us is we've done that in the pandemic, which was really the point of the nation's need. But the key question now is where can we best deploy our resources to support the NHS? Where are the things that maybe fit best to our charitable need? So, helping those in society, where can we get not quite the biggest bang for buck, but in a pandemic, you do anything you can to help. But actually now we want to kind of be a bit more selective about where do we think a volunteer model, which is, a key part of what we do, is best placed to serve the NHS. So we're looking at specific services that we want to take on and how we approach that. So, so for example, particular health needs, so cardiac and heart health, and how we might contribute there, but also the levels of falls within society. So falls are a major problem, both for an operational problem for call outs of ambulances, but also for the poor, unfortunate people that have fallen. So the likelihood, your life expectancy, can often be directly linked to how long you've been left in a position when you've fallen in the home or in the environment. So it's in all our interest to get people up, to get them healthy again. And again, we're quite uniquely positioned to take on some of that with a combination of our ambulance support, but also our kind of volunteers and the ability to go to people's houses and help them. So that's, I guess that's one strategic bit. The other, I guess, is a more wholesale digital transformation, which will start to get us in towards technology. So what we've been doing is all of those different services that I've described largely grew up in historic silos. So we've got multiple sales systems, multiple sales processes and systems, multiple operational and fulfillment systems and processes. Part of what we're looking at doing is standardizing those things, getting ourselves onto one core operating model where, operational and back office tasks are provided in one way to all customers, regardless of whether that customer is an ambulance trust, an NHS trust, or a big corporate customer buying training. So, that kind of thing is a key part of what we're doing and is massively digitally enabled, because we've quite a lot of duplication, rekeying across those systems. So we're doing a lot of that to try and improve the cost base, but also to improve the level of service to our donors, to our customers.
So really interesting points. And I want to, spend a little bit more time on the latter, because it sounds like a very traditional form of digital transformation, right? Where you have these, like you said, legacy silos, which have been based on, I guess, legacy architectures and infrastructure. The things that St. John's Ambulance do have changed since those systems were in place. The organization has got more complex and larger. And now you're in a new reality where you have to have, that new single way of operating. And the digital transformation is basically enabling that, right? This new state the organization is in. So I'm already guessing some of the trends and the technologies that you're probably using, but I'd hate to steal your thunder. So could I ask for maybe some actual concrete projects which went into that digital transformation?
Sure, no trouble at all. So as you'd expect, possibly on an infrastructure podcast, the layers of the infrastructure are fairly critical. So over the course of the time that I've been in role, we've moved all of the existing applications into, so that was all completed as of the middle of last year. So kind of the bottom end of our stack, so to speak, has all been successfully moved. But what we're also doing alongside that at the very front end is moving forward with a platform solution. So software as a service, Dynamics in this case that we've chosen as our base, we're in the midst of an implementation of that. So that is starting from our perspective, it's starting from the CRM angle, because our customer base in the broadest possible term is very broad. So customer for us means organizations that buy from us, so trusts, corporates, but it also means a wide variety of individuals. So it's donors, it's workplace training delegates, it's some of the youth schemes that I described earlier. So what we want to do is to get to a really smart, digitally enabled customer journey for those individuals. But that platform thinking will go the whole way through. So that will move from what is largely a CRM and inquiry management type based piece through to fulfillment. So in our case, that's about our volunteers scheduling themselves on shifts and us managing shifts and all of that kind of stuff, but right into back end financials and everything as well. So we've started at the front end and are going through, but very much with a platform base. Over and above that, I guess the other critical piece of what we're delivering is unique to this environment, which is electronic patient records. So that is much more specific applications around how you capture a treatment record for an individual that you treat in whichever of our locations, all of which will be, instead of paper forms, will be handhelds on the ambulances, in the hands of the first aiders, potentially mobile apps, etc. So that's the kind of broad combination of things that we're playing with.
Okay, so a couple of things that I picked up on there, a couple that I want to dig further on.
Sure.
You mentioned a lot about front end and like enabling those front end systems which will enable your customers, i.e. organizations who are buying or using services, for that to be a more seamless process. Sounds like it was probably a little bit clunky before you re-platformed some of the applications, and so what you're enabling is increased revenue, but through that digital transformation, making it easier for organizations to procure from you, right? But the other element that I picked up on, and which was about the electronic patient records, is more to do with your employees, it seems. So not necessarily like a traditional organization where you've got everyone who's sitting in 1, 2, 3 branch offices. You've got people who are roaming everywhere around the country, and mobility sounds like a big thing. So could you maybe just give us a little bit more context around how how digital transformation played a part in, I guess, securing all of your roaming employees and like enabling them to do their jobs, maybe how that was performed with legacy technology and how it's transformed as you've gone through a transformation? Nice, easy question for you there.
Yeah. So I think your split works well. I mean, the big change on the first one, aside from standard kind of CRM and good processes, is the visibility right across our customer base. So as an example, a workplace training delegate who attends the first aid course for their workplace currently sits on a different system to our donors, sits on a different system, something else. We want to be able to turn around and say, you've just completed this training course. Welcome to the family. Here's your qualification. If you'd be interested in hearing more about our work, if you'd be interested in becoming a volunteer, which is cross-sell by another shape, make, or form. So in the first half, that's probably the big cultural shift with the individuals. I think with the second half of mobile, the change is pretty massive. The existing systems are largely paper-based. Were you still on the rugby field or on the football field and arrived into, well, you may well be, but if you arrived into a St. John ambulance, you would be assessed in a very professional manner. We would take care of you, but you would disappear away still with a paper form currently. So for example, a classic from my own kids' sporting days, a concussion or something of that ilk, you walk away or your parent walks away with a piece of paper. And if you then end up going into hospital later in that day, that's the piece of paper. So what we've had to do is, in effect, put in place a digital solution, which is largely in its simplest form an electronic form. A layered electronic form, because the complexity of the case determines how much information you have to collect. But what you're doing really is making what is in a way slightly data entry-ish as quick as possible, as intuitive as possible. Whatever pathway you're supposed to follow in terms of the right treatment is driven by the solution as well. And as you say, you've got to keep all of that secure. So you've got to keep that secure to the individual. You've then got the challenge of, okay, you've got that information in your system's absolutely fantastic. That individual could go to any NHS trust. So, a given individual will go to one of 4 hospitals, probably in the area if they need to. We need to have a way of getting that electronically transformed and into the hospital, so that whoever's assessing in hospital has a starting record of when the case actually started, what prevention was given, how, exact timings if that's relevant, vital signs if that's relevant. And that continuity of care is fundamental in the most serious cases to be keeping people alive. So that's what it's about.
So we could probably talk all day about the what went in behind that, and as much as I would like to do it, there's not enough time in the day for that. But that's really interesting to hear about that digital transformation, and it is kind of a buzzword, right? So it's interesting to understand what actually goes, how does a digital transformation actually manifest itself into concrete projects.
Yeah.
But I touched upon it earlier. I'm also interested to hear about your role as CIO, interim CIO, a transformation director. So maybe just to kick off, could you explain the difference between, or maybe the nuances of being an interim CIO versus a full-time or permanent CIO?
Yeah, so I guess the call or the bat sign tends to go up for one of 2 reasons. It's usually either a significant problem, so it's a steady the ship. We've had a major problem. We've got an outgoing CIO, or a major program of investment has gone severely pear-shaped, and we need somebody who's got a lot of experience to come in and stabilize. And I have had a couple of briefs like that. In the case of St. John, it was very much a lot of our projects have not quite been siloed, but they've reflected the existing structure of the organization. They've not been holistic in their nature. What we need is somebody who has the digital and IT nous to be able to deliver on the agenda, because this role obviously includes live system support and incident support and everything else like that as well. But it also has to cover, how do you actually transform? So one of the things that became very obvious quite quickly in this, the systems, apart from being aging and mature and all of, sorry, that's the same thing, but apart from being those things, it was also reflective of the organization and the fact that it was quite stovepiped. So you do need a transformational type framing to get to a different result. So if you're going to convince people to go to a common journey and set of community journeys for different types or different members of that community, you've got to have a degree of leadership. You've got to have seen that done before. You've got to be able to build a compelling vision of it, because most of the individuals operating in the environment won't have seen this, or won't see it in their day-to-day work there. So it's more about framing that transformation that I tend to find I've been brought into. The other big thing usually is the stakeholder side of things. Everywhere I go for interviews or discussions on these kind of roles, it's always about how complex a stakeholder map have you dealt with. How do you build these coalitions? What do you do? How do you tackle resistance? All of those good things. And to be honest, that's what I enjoy about doing it. I think, in terms of potential downsides, there is always the obvious, which is you can be perceived as an external or too external. You can get tissue rejection. Some people can get tissue rejection. To be frank, I'm a bit of a joiner. So people it usually takes them a while to work out that I'm an interim. And I don't really if you can act like an interim, I only use my experience of other places as an example for that particular circumstance, rather than as a complaint, if that makes sense. So I tend to find this as a positive, but I do know others who sometimes you can get tissue rejection with an interim, or people might think sometimes they can outlast you. if they don't want to do something, they can tap dance for a while and try and avoid the agenda.
So things that I took from that are that, aside from just doing the day-to-day CIO role, you also have that element of transformation and consultancy, I would say.
Yeah.
And coming in not just to deliver on the day-to-day objectives of a CIO, but there's a specific reason or projects or initiatives that you've been brought in to oversee, and that you have that other dynamic and that other, I guess, theme or feeling to the role.
Yeah.
And the other thing that really interested me and that I wanted to dive a bit deeper on is that tissue element. And do you feel that because there is a finality with being, in the interim role, and people may not know that, but did you ever feel like, because you knew perhaps that you were only going to be there till November 2022, you would pull back on making certain decisions, or it kind of blinkered your view, and it maybe sharpened your thinking as to what you really need to do within that time?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, in most cases, I've helped recruit the CIO, and that's been true of this circumstance. So I am in effect handing them a role that I've not quite defined for them, but sought to define. In a lot of cases, I'm also retained in an advisory capacity, sometimes for 3 to 6 months. So I feel very, very responsible for what happens next. I think the interesting question, the one area where I think you do have to be quite careful is organization change. So in going into an organization, I will look at the team that's needed to deliver, but I won't necessarily look at restructuring it, because virtually everybody has a view of how they like their structure. And you don't want to put people through a structure change twice. So that's the one I'm usually hesitant on, where I kind of say, well, unless it desperately needs changing, then I'm going to work within the organizational structure I've got and supplement the skills I need within the team. But I'm going to leave it to the incoming CIO to kind of say, well, I'd like to organize DevOps like this or something like that. But again, that probably depends a bit upon the timing. But that's just more being, I think, fair to the teams and individuals you're working with.
So there's, although there is a finality to the role, and there probably is going to be a day when you're no longer the interim and you go into that advisory role. It doesn't necessarily, in most cases, scarper your view, because you're not cutting ties at the end of that contract or that period. So there's definitely a continuity element to that there. So really interesting. Super exciting to hear about projects and that dynamic of being of the CIO role, which I've not spoken about before or encountered. So interesting to hear about. But I guess as part of your role as CIO, you're probably responsible for onboarding and purchasing new technologies as well.
Yeah,
sounds like there's been a fair bit of that's gone on. So I'm interested to hear about that process. And sometimes when I speak to people like yourself, there's a little bit of loggerheads and tension that comes with dealing with vendors, and being in a position of power, and having people and vendors trying to get time in your calendar and introduce you to new technologies.
Cool.
So how have you found that process? Do you find that an enjoyable one? Is it something that burdens you from doing your day job because you're getting pestered with cold calls? Or tell me about that
yeah,
engagement.
I think it's probably a mixed bag. I mean, in terms of context, probably the key thing to say is most of the organizations have worked in have been reasonably large. So procurement processes, there is typically a procurement team. Most things follow a given procurement process. So, for the big decisions that we've taken, like the choice of platform, like a couple of the key solution choices, those have been things that have gone through RFP. So, that's classic RFP, which is based on an understanding of the market, occasionally, cross-checking with Forrester, Gartner, to develop your shortlist and understand who you should be talking to. But the vast majority of the purchasing decisions have been like that. I think the thing I'd say in terms of when the supplier is on board, that's when I then feel I have the biggest role, right? Because an organization like this, but many of the ones I've worked in, it can take you 3, 4, 5, 6 months to get your head around how it works, what the governance is, where the relationships are, and where it isn't obvious, what's different to the structure, who the influencers are. And generally speaking, if the supplier is in and contracted, I take it as my view that I want to get them as effective in that as possible. So it will be not education, but it will be, how do I get that team as effective as possible? Having gone through not quite the hoops of a selection process, but having won that exercise to try and go, right, you've got it. We really want to do this with you. How do I make sure that this is as successful as possible in relationship? And that, again, possibly because of the interim nature, and I'm always in a reasonable hurry to get these things done. Yeah. I want those people to be as effective as possible, as quickly as possible. So that's the guts of a lot of my time with suppliers. I guess the other stuff you've alluded to, I get the male equivalent of cold calls than cold calls per se. 30, 40, 50 a day. Wow. And it can be problematic. I guess because of the nature of which the way in which we procure, there's very little that I would directly respond to. Yeah. Being completely honest, the things that I do respond to are things like think pieces. So interesting conferences, interesting research, white papers on stuff where actually I get a look and feel for what they're thinking on something is. I can see it potentially addresses something I'm looking to do, and therefore that results in a conversation. Now, again, it may well be that puts them in a position to go through an RFP process rather than me immediately say, there's a piece of work and it's yours, unless it's a smaller piece. Yeah. But that's where I find the value add. Either, I guess, one is something that might make us think about the nature of the technology in a way that we haven't thought before, but also, anybody who's really gone to the trouble to think about what it is your organization does, potential ways of doing it. And that's hard, right? It is hard if you're in a sales and biz dev role. But those sorts of things, I think, are the most useful, where people are actually saying, I can see through their market intelligence or whatever else that you're doing a program here. We actually have quite a lot of skills in this arena. Have you looked at your testing solution for this? Rather than just because to be honest, if you're getting that many emails, if somebody's just got your name and wants to tell us about their great services, the chances of me contacting them back are pretty limited because they haven't peaked anything, if that makes sense.
So what you need and what you like to see is, well, two things that I picked up on is becoming educated and, something that is going to allow you to get a grip of the market or to understand your options, something that you don't know right now, which is going to help you in the things that you're trying to achieve, either with a new project or in your day-to-day job. Anything that can help you with that is valuable, and you will consider, taking a call about or attending.
Yeah.
And then the second thing was about my mind's gone blank.
Yeah, no. So it effectively illustrating understanding.
Exactly, a hypothesis. The word that I was looking for was a hypothesis, right? So when a vendor has done their research and has actually taken the time to understand your organization and piece together a story and a hypothesis about how they can actually help you, that's useful to you, right? And it shows there's a level of professionalism and effort behind it.
Yeah. So, and that makes a bit of a difference because you can kind of, it's much easier to join the dots, right? Whereas if you've got a decent volume of mails and it's, I'm from X, we do this in this area, you kind of go, I could feasibly see that might be relevant. Now, clearly, if it happened to be something that I absolutely knew, I was going out shopping for, it's a completely different exercise, but that's less likely to be the case.
So final question on this, Brian, because it's an interesting one for me, is do you find that the the conversations that you will engage with, or the meetings that you will take, it's because there's already an ongoing project, or you know that element of technology is in your roadmap, and so it's important for you to educate yourself about? Or do you find that there's a percentage still of things which are not really relevant, you haven't thought about yet, but that email or that piece of research that they have given you has piqued your interest, and even though it may not be an immediate project, you still want to learn more about it?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. It's a bit of both, and it's a good question, because I think it might relate to the two examples I've given. Because if somebody's done their homework, so if you go back to something we were discussing earlier, I'm really interested in different points of view about customer experience, because I can kind of see that that isn't necessarily something that I want to drive from what is the typical third sector or charity experience.
Yeah.
These are a group of individuals of mixed ages who have very different needs, who interact with technology in different ways.
Yeah.
Where's the parallel between that and another organization? Not necessarily a bank, actually, or something like that. You know, where's a good parallel? Where are really good examples of where people have made a breakthrough in customer experience? Those kind of things are really useful. The other, actually, that probably springs to mind is where different technologies get knitted together in different ways. So I would say, for example, we haven't particularly talked about more innovative stuff, but we've done quite a bit with robotic process automation, in the last year as well. And it started as a business problem about some of our high volume activities, and it was specifically about bringing the vaccination volunteers on. And it was just enough to say, how expert are you at getting these operational processes in? Done this kind of work on banking transactions. So there was no industry parallel. Yeah. They just showed the similarity between the operational processes we were trying to automate, yeah, and what we were trying to do. And Rita, our first robot, was born and has been in operation for a year. So those kind of things can be a bit more tangential, I guess, but can be really valuable as well.
But there's still that element of thinking that has gone behind it, right? Someone has taken the time to say, this is relevant in this use case in the banking industry. This is how it could be applicable to St. John's Ambulance. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, yeah.
So that has been super insightful, Brian. That's been really, really interesting to sit down and talk about. And I wanted to give the last few minutes open to you to maybe share anything else that you wanted to discuss, or if there's any advisory roles, or anything particularly that you're looking for, or you think you can add value to at the moment. The floor is yours, pretty much.
Yeah, so I guess I'm in my mid-50s. I don't know whether I'm looking good or bad on it, but I guess I'm at that stage where I'm doing a mix of the kind of classic interim roles and growing roles in advisory. I do love advisory work, so I like wrestling with my own organization's problems, but I also quite like wrestling and helping others with theirs. So always interested in those kind of opportunities. Probably, as was illustrated by what I've just described, I'm really interested in the ones where technology and transformation intersect. Okay. My career over the last 10, 15 years has all been about large organizational transformations right across sector. It's been a mix of, so I've done a couple of IPOs, I've done integrations, I've done post-merger integrations. So what I really like is that thing of understanding how operating models can shift, what you can do, and how digital enables you to do these things much more quickly. How a transition to a new operating model could actually be achieved astonishingly quickly. Firstly, because you work out you want to go there, but secondly, because the tools are so much more effective to get you where you want to be. So your lead time to actually deliver the transformation can come down. So that's the sort of thing I'm interested in. And been really, really, really good to chat to you as well. Very enjoyable.
Been amazing, Brian. I do appreciate you taking your time in the evenings to have a chat with me. Loads of great insights. Interesting to hear the depth of St. John's Ambulance as well. So yeah, great to have you on, Brian, and we'll catch up soon.
Cheers. Goodbye.
Cheers.